Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you are here for Brain Talk and the Language of Regulation. Before I introduce Hanna and we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors. We Play OT, Flory Glussman and her team of occupational therapists understand the importance of collaboration, and they are just huge supporters of the Powerful Project, and we are so appreciative of their support. Perspective Center for Holistic Therapy and all of the psychotherapists, speech therapists, and clinical interns. You are our biggest clinical partner, and we could not do what we do without Perspective support. So thank you. And lastly, Brain Insights, Deborah McNellis and Neuro Nurturing Activity Practice, supporting healthy development from newborn on up. We are so appreciative of Neuro Nurturing and Brain Insights. And now I want to give a quick shout out before I introduce Hanna, her co-creator of Brain Insights, Carrie Lindemuth, who is an educational therapist and professional social emotional learning specialist based in Oakland, California. Hi, Carrie. We're so glad you're here. Carrie and Hanna thought, since this is such a short time, a quick presentation in an hour, that it would be smoother for Hanna to present, and Carrie can contribute to the Q&A at the end. So we're so glad to have your energy here, though, today, Carrie. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Hanna Bogen Novak, MS CCC-SLP, speech language pathologist and social cognitive specialist based in Los Angeles, California. Hanna specializes in interventions that support self-regulation, social communication, executive functioning, and speech language challenges. In addition to providing individual and group therapy, she trains and consults with schools and therapy teams to support a greater understanding of self-regulation, executive functioning, mindfulness, etc. And at the end of this, you'll have an opportunity, because we were in conversation that maybe we would put together a parent group around this topic. So if you're interested, you'll have that opportunity to express that interest. As I had mentioned, the chat box is open. You can type in questions, and at the end we'll have Q&A, and we're going to try to stick within this 1 hour time frame. So with much appreciation and excitement, Hanna, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be doing this. I'm so excited everybody is here. I have, in the moment, completely forgotten how to turn off the little ding dong sound. So you may hear more people entering, which is wonderful and exciting. And we will just embrace the new folks as they come in. So let's dive in our limited time that we have. My name is Hanna. I am many things these days. I like to say I have my hand in a lot of different cookie jars, because that makes me feel like I get cookies at the end of it. But I want to give just sort of a very brief introduction so you know why I'm here talking about this stuff. And the stuff that we're going to be talking about is sort of it's kind of like an inch deep of beginning to understand a lens of executive functioning as it encompasses self-regulation, and how we can think about almost like a paradigm shift of ensuring that all students, not just students who maybe have an IEP, not just students who are fortunate enough to come to services, but all students are learning about their brains, and about the language of metacognition as part of their, ongoing development. And I will admit, I am a few days post, hopefully being fully recovered from bronchitis. So I'm very grateful that the fates have timed this out, so that was last week. But if I get a little frog in my throat, apologies in advance. So of the many hats or cookie jars that I'm sort of affiliated with, a big one these days is where my clinical practice happens, and that is at a place called the Center for Connection. Anybody who's familiar with Dan Siegel and Tina Payne-Bryson, who are the co-authors of a series of books, I think most notably The Whole Brain Child. This is Tina's practice, and it is an absolute joy to be at such an incredible interdisciplinary center where we look through the lens of something called interpersonal neurobiology. And that's very much an impact on how, or an influence, I should say, on how I think about supporting children and designing interventions and support plans for families. The idea that we cannot put blinders on and say, well, I just do communication. And so if you've got sensory stuff going on, not my thing. Or yikes, there's some mental health stuff going on, not my thing. But that we are I will sometimes say we have enough information about our fellow colleagues, if for those of you who are professionals, to make us dangerous, enough that we know when to refer, who to bring in, and how to honor the work that our colleagues are doing with kids so that there is wraparound support. And we are really thinking about individuals both from the bottom up and not just from the top down. So both of those things simultaneously. So that's a big place where most of my clinical work is happening. I do also run a private practice. I do a lot of school consultations. So I do not just think about support in a one-to-one or small group context, but often I'm thinking about this as, what do these things look like when you have 32 kids all together in a classroom, and those kids have really varying needs based on their developmental growth up to that point. And of course, the framework that's going to guide us today is sort of the baby that Carrie and I created a few years back, Brain Talk curriculum. And you will get just a tiny little taste of how a story of neural integration, a story of how the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain begin to connect so that we over time are more able to respond mindfully to various situations as opposed to reacting impulsively, how that story is in and of itself so unbelievably powerful for then allowing kids to access and more independently utilize the kinds of tools that they perhaps have been introduced to in other therapeutic contexts. So that's who I am. And I do want to mention that Brain Talk is going to guide us today. That does not mean that Brain Talk is sort of the holier than thou, the only ideal support out there. It is one of many, many, many frameworks and supports and tools that you can access. And Carrie and I can talk about this more at the end during the Q&A, but we felt like there were such amazing tool-based programs and curricula out there for students where we felt like there wasn't as much resource was the story of why an impulse is even happening, and trying to take that out of a very top-down approach of just telling a student and really putting the control into a child's hands to say, this is your story to understand brains. And then you have the reins to think about how all of this connects to your brain with guidance to become a more productive metacognitive thinker. And so that's where Brain Talk came from. This is a little bit of a buckle up, you're on the roller coaster now version of a talk I would normally do. So those of you who think, oh my gosh, how could I ever talk to a group of people for 45 minutes? I'm the person who thinks, oh my gosh, how could I ever fit all of this into an 8-hour training? So 45 minutes and then Q&A is, I'm like weeping every slide I pull out up until the last second, thinking they have to know this. But what I promise you is we are going to get the foundation of what I want you to be able to take away today. We're going to build a really lovely foundation, and then hopefully it sets you up to more intentionally be using strategies and tools that either you've been introducing with students before or that you hope to introduce with students, and you have this foundation to tie everything back to, which is the brain. So we're going to take a little tour of something we think about called the brain house. We're going to very briefly talk about self-regulation and executive functioning through the Brain Talk lens. And this is very much an interdisciplinary lens. So if there are professionals in the audience, really regardless of the kind of work you're doing with students, hopefully this is a lens that is going to make sense for your practice. We're going to talk super briefly about some of the language of regulation and have some time for Q&A at the end. So let's head into the brain house. This may look somewhat familiar to some of you, and this may be really new. But what's not new is that the brain is unbelievably complicated, and that we continue to learn about brain integration and brain specialization, sort of differentiation and connectivity constantly. We're learning about how brains grow and change over time. We're learning about what has stayed the same through, generations of evolution. And as much as the perfectionist in me wants to have all of those details expressed, kids need a story that makes sense to them. Kids need a story that they can take ownership over. And the Brain House is an excellent way to begin to introduce that. And so we think about this as an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. And when you walk into the house, we're not talking about a hillside property in the Los Angeles hills, where you walk into the upstairs. When you walk into the house, you're downstairs. You come in the front door and you are immediately thrust into this space that is concerned with safety and comfort. Because ultimately, the goal of the brain at the end of the day is to keep us alive. And so survival becomes the top priority, and everything else can occur and flourish as long as we are safe. It is both helpful and sometimes a little bit difficult to squish together the safety and comfort piece. And I'm going to get to that when we talk a little bit about language and strategies of regulation, because there are times where we are going to be safe and still feel uncomfortable. And those are often resilience building opportunities. These are the moments to sort of stretch out that window of tolerance for ourselves or for a child, and to begin to help them create some delineation between something that is truly a threat to their safety or a threat to their survival, and something that is understandably uncomfortable, where they are engaging self-regulation competencies in order to make it through that, and ideally make it through that in a slightly more comfortable way than before. But in a perfect scenario, information comes into the brain up through your central nervous system, and you have structures in your downstairs brain that are determining, am I safe and am I comfortable? And assuming that more or less the answer to those questions is yes, then information continues to travel up the staircase via connection between the upstairs and downstairs brain, and it hits the upstairs. And this is where we get to engage networks of the brain, not so much individual structures, but really thinking about networks of connectivity that allow us to identify long-term and even short-term goals, to make plans around that, to use critical thinking to weigh consequences and consider alternatives and anticipate obstacles. We apply language to this, right? We're combining visualization and language, and then doing a lot of reflection. So much of this is happening maybe not just in the upstairs brain, but due to integration or connection between the two levels of the brain as we sort of condense things. Now, because survival is the priority, when the answer to that initial question, am I safe, is no. I am not safe in this situation. And also to an extent, am I comfortable, if that answer is also no, we get this metaphorical baby gate, or you can even think sometimes it is a slamming door in the staircase that is not allowing good connectivity and integration up to the upstairs brain. And that is an intentional feature of the brain, right? This is like our safeguard, because if you truly are unsafe, you don't need a bunch of resources being shunted to the upstairs brain to do immense critical thinking and goal setting. You need to react and you need to survive. And so the function of impulsivity is an excellent, critical, important, life-preserving function of the brain. And making sure that our kids understand that we are not that we are not sort of assigning a negative connotation to the idea of impulsivity is really important, because brains are doing this for a good reason. However, if it's happening in situations where that access to the upstairs brain would have allowed that student, that child, to respond in a way that was more aligned with their ultimate goals, and frankly, that may actually more align with safety and comfort in a longer term setting, then we don't want that baby gate slamming closed. And that's why the integration of upstairs and downstairs is so critical. There are some key residents that I want to point out. Now, this is a massive short list, but these are the ones that we highlight in Brain Talk. And in the downstairs brain, we really want to send home this idea that your impulses are primarily driven by seek or avoid, or I should say, I'm sorry, your reactions are primarily driven by seek or avoid impulses. And the seek impulse is sort of governed by this network called the basal pleasure and reward circuit. And there's, again, as with anything with the brain, there's a lot more to it. But if we were to condense it into something really approachable for kids, we want to personify this and externalize it a bit so that there's a sense of ownership and control over this network of the brain in order to better understand it. And our threat impulse is highly governed by the amygdala and related circuitry that is connected with the amygdala. And we're going to talk about how we've sort of named some of these characters so that they make sense to kids, because I don't expect a 5-year-old to necessarily remember amygdala and basal pleasure and reward circuit. Some kids would, but most kids want this personified. They want characters. They want the story. Now, your brain's librarian, your episodic personal memory center is super important to decision making because it allows some lovely conversation between the downstairs brain and upstairs brain, and that's the hippocampus. And it would say things like, it's sort of metaphorically saying things like, have we done something like this before? And was it truly threatening to our survival? Or did this potential opportunity actually benefit us in a way that was meaningful to the extent that we should do it again at the risk of getting in trouble or at the risk of getting that other reward out there? Was this really that rewarding? And then as this conversation ensues, we get to incorporate what we call the professor, the prefrontal cortex, and again, related circuitry and structures that are doing a lot of mental time travel work and allowing us to sort of think out into the future and say, what is a reward that I am trying to work towards? And we could spend lots of time thinking about appropriate time windows for things to be intrinsically motivating for somebody, but we unfortunately don't have time for that today. But if we were to assume the best and say, no, there is sort of an appropriate developmentally expected reward that we've sort of put out into the future for a child, the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in being able to create a plan that is guiding that person towards attaining that reward. So we have these key residents that are existing in the house. We have some that really are downstairs residents and some that are allowing, the hippocampus is doing a lot of conversation between the upstairs and the downstairs. And then you have the prefrontal cortex situated in the upstairs part of the brain, needing to have information travel fluidly up that staircase. So you can pretty quickly see what's going to happen if there isn't connectivity, if that baby gate is slamming closed and there isn't connectivity or integration between these levels of the brain. Now, in an ideal situation where we have integration that leads to responding, it might sound something like this. Now, remember, we're starting at the bottom because information is coming in through the downstairs brain. So that you see your number 1 here. And you might have this messaging that is being created by the downstairs brain going, hey, we're uncomfortable in this now bubble. Like right now, I feel uncomfortable. And so we should either seek this opportunity that's going to make me feel comfortable, or we should avoid this thing that feels threatening as quickly as possible. But that is happening in a way that is not so loud and so overwhelming that information is still able to travel up the staircase. And so it's hitting the hippocampus, right? Our brain's librarian, it's hitting the professor. And together, these circuits are beginning to say, hey, we hear you downstairs brain. Let's pause. Let's pause and breathe. We want that ultimate reward out there in the future. And we've learned from past experiences and personal narratives, these things from our past. So let's use that information to make a plan for right now. And I'm going to give you a visual in a moment that is going to encapsulate this movement that's happening when we do not just react in a now bubble, but in fact, we incorporate the future. We incorporate the past. We essentially are expanding the now bubble to encompass more of our mental timeline, so that we can mindfully respond and make better, arguably better decisions, and make decisions, period, right? We're not just hijacked by our emotions and then hostages to the reactions we have as a result. Now, when there is a lack of connection and as a result, a reaction, you get something a little bit more like this. I'm uncomfortable, but no. The end is coming. Survive, go, react, do, act. And the upstairs brain can't get a word in. So the upstairs brain is sort of there saying, excuse me, hey, can you hear us downstairs? Is anyone there? And the downstairs brain is just running around in circles screaming. And so there is not the ability to have this conversation of integration. There is not brain talk going on. And as a result, the brain is going to shunt and prioritize resources into where the downstairs brain wants to react in order to seek as quickly as possible the thing that might be rewarding, the thing that appears to be an opportunity, or avoid, through things like fight, flight, freeze reactions, the thing that feels threatening and uncomfortable. And this is like a super condensed, super fast version of what integration or lack thereof looks like between upstairs and downstairs brains.
And
So,
I just wanted to say, I'm sure many a parent who is watching now or an educator knows the translation of that is the meltdown. when the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain are not communicating, and we see a major
Absolutely. And that can look like a lot of different things. So as we move through this talk, we're going to dive into what that can look like, because absolutely, sometimes it looks like this huge sort of externalized meltdown. And it's exactly what we expect. It's the screaming, it's the, slamming your fist on the floor, it's crying, it's big, big, big. It's the volcano erupting. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something different. Sometimes it's more subtle. Sometimes it's more internal. So it can be a lot of different things. And it really depends, not just on the child, because everybody doesn't always react in the same way every time. We know that people have all kinds of ways that they react. Some people are more patterned in their reactions, certainly, but the situation is going to dictate a lot about how somebody reacts, how long it takes to recover, and then do they learn, or how do they learn from that experience, and how does that actually define the narrative of how they might react or respond in the future. So that's a big piece of this as well, this idea of personal narratives we take away from our own experiences based on the conversation between upstairs and downstairs brain, or not. So the movement I talked about a few moments ago, where in this now bubble, like at the intersection of these lines, is this moment of now. And if all we do is react, we're driven by these MIG moments or Buster Bams, otherwise thought of as these avoid reactions or grab and gulp reactions of avoid or seek. And we do what feels comfortable in the now bubble. And I certainly am not going to say that every time this is problematic. I began by saying this is a really important feature of the brain. There are times where this is exactly what we want to have happen. And there are times where it's not really what we want to have happen, but the kid does it and it kind of works out for them. But what is not available to a child in a moment of reacting in a now bubble is choice. The ability to say, that is actually the way I wanted to act. And so even if it works out in the end, feeling like you are a hostage to your own emotions or downstairs brain experience is fundamentally a lack of control. And most of us know and probably relate to the idea that we feel safer, more comfortable, and more capable of responding when we feel like we're in control of our experiences in our world. And so If this helps you, then this is a great visual to come back to say the goal. What we mean when we talk about expanding the window of tolerance to begin to just incrementally inch open a child's ability to respond is that we are slowly but surely encompassing the future into their decision making. Hey, what is it that you were trying to get in the future? What are you working towards? How do you want this to sound, look, be, feel? All of that creates a tether to the upstairs brain and to the professor, the prefrontal cortex, to just hold on to all of those wonderful upstairs brain competencies, critical thinking and problem solving and reflection and planning and all of those lovely executive functioning competencies we want on board. And then we want to engage reflection of the past. Have I experienced something like this before? We're sort of shifting, we're swinging now into the past. Have I experienced something like this before? Did it work out? Why? Why not? Do I want to use a similar experience to help me make a plan to be as successful as possible? And then we come right back to this intersection point of right now. And these are some questions to help you begin to think about, how well does your student do something like this? Do you work with students, or do you have a child who gets really stuck in a now bubble? And that they become highly defensive because they don't feel responsible for the consequences that have ensued from their actions necessarily, because in that moment of now, they weren't planning to make somebody, feel bad. They weren't planning to hit. They weren't planning to derail the lesson in the classroom. They were just trying to get comfortable. And so now they're being told that they're responsible for that kid crying, or the teacher feeling angry with them, or their parent having lost their patience. But they are so driven by now bubble reactions that it's hard for them to even be able to hold that responsibility. And it feels really unfair, and it feels exhausting. Imagine that is your experience. You sort of go through life and things are happening and you're not always in a feeling of control. And then people are saying, hey, you need to go pick up all the pieces of that bomb that just went off because that's your responsibility. It's exhausting. Can students actually determine what they want their ultimate outcome to be? This is really difficult for a lot of kids. This involves nonverbal working memory. It involves visualization competencies. It involves the ability to then take something that you imagine. What does future Hannah, how am I going to look or feel, or what am I going to be doing? And then be able to express that in a symbolic way to somebody else, whether that's verbally, whether that's in some other capacity, but all of that takes a lot of integration. Can a student connect a present experience to a similar past experience? And can they use future goals combined with past experiences to make a plan for what to do right now? And if your answer is no, it may be because we don't expect people to be able to do all of these things perfectly for a long time. So it makes tons of sense that a child isn't able to do all of these things. And that these are competencies that are developing over the course of our, childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and frankly, well into adulthood. However, if you can begin to identify some places where a child is having difficulty, and I actually did put these in an intentional sort of order, because I think if your child is getting stuck in a now bubble, that's where you have to begin. You have to help them be aware that they're even in a now bubble, right? That if you just say, well, I'm only going to work on past experiences and reflection, that doesn't matter because they will still react in the now bubble. And so we do have to think intentionally about how we're going to support kids in a developmental, meaningful way. And I hope that this actually gives you a little bit of a roadmap to be able to do that. Consequently, we can think about executive functioning in a way that honors this movement of mental time travel and really honors the fact that we have to encompass, as Russell Barkley would say, self-regulation into our understanding of executive functioning. And so Carrie and I, and really I credit Carrie with this because she's just the most beautifully brilliant human I think I've ever met in my life. And I'm so grateful that she's in my life. So we talk about executive functioning like an Oreo cookie because it's delicious and because it makes a lot of sense. That the kind of executive functioning most people are familiar with is this stuff in the middle, the cream, the strategic thinking, all the planning bits. But before you can get there, you have to be able to self-regulate, to pause the impulse to react. You have to be able to pause and expand the now bubble. You have to. You can have the best plan in the world with the most beautiful color-coded folders and all the tabs and all the whatevers, you know, the sticky notes on the calendar. All of that can be excellent. And if you just react, you will never get to the plan. And so asking yourself at a deep level, do I have kids who are having a difficult time with the self-regulatory aspects of executive functioning, will allow you to step back and say, I do need to work on strategic thinking, perhaps, and we need to sort of back up and start at the place where my child is experiencing initial difficulty. And this is not just a top-down, let me teach you about self-regulation and hand you some tools for your toolbox. This is about really thoughtfully investigating. At the Center of Connection, we call this chasing the why, thoughtfully investigating what is making this difficult. Is there sort of a sensory constellation component to this, where sensory differences and difficulties are making it hard for the child to feel safe and comfortable in a situation where other kids might be doing okay? Is there a fundamental anxiety component to this, where a child needs support around feelings of anxiety that are exacerbating their likelihood of reacting? What is going on? You know, do they need help with initiation, getting started piece? What is actually going on at a fundamental level that is impeding a child from accessing strategic thinking competencies and skills? And then they're right back to self-regulation. You can get to the plan and then you have to follow the plan, which is right back to being able to inhibit impulses in order to follow through with what you have identified as your plan to get to your goal. And this does mirror a very bottom-up approach to supporting self-regulation and executive functioning. That at the end of the day, what we need to communicate to a child who is dysregulated, first and foremost, is not, hey, I have an idea for you. Hey, don't worry, this is easy to solve. Hey, this is actually just a little deal, right? It's not those things. It can be those things eventually, but the first thing we have to communicate in no uncertain terms is you are safe. I say those words so many times a day. I say them to my own children. I say them to the kids with whom I'm working in clinics and in schools. I say it all the time. And as uncomfortable as that may feel on a professional level or a personal level, depending on, you know, who it is you're working with, we need to get comfortable with the language of safety. I see how upset you are. You are safe with me. We are safe right here. This is always a place where you are going to be safe. There is nothing you can say or do that will make me force you to feel unsafe. Right? That is so important because the survival brain needs to have sort of the little whisper of it's okay. And then we need to speak to the feeling part of the brain, the comfort, right? So when we do brain house, we're squishing the red and the blue together. We're squishing the triunal brain into two levels, but some version of, and these are both self-regulatory intervention places. I am with you while you're feeling blank, or it is okay to feel that way. It is okay to feel really angry with this boundary right now. And we both have to be safe in this room. It is not okay to throw. It is not okay to kick the chair, whatever it might be. Only then can you arrive at some version of we can solve this together. I am here to help you. How can I make you feel a little more comfortable right now in this difficult or challenging situation, right? You don't have to use these words exactly as they're written, but we need to find ways to begin from the bottom up by speaking to the parts of the brain as we understand reactivity and responding. Super, super important. Okay. Oh my gosh, we are just flying and we're going to keep flying. So I'm not even going to breathe or take a sip of water yet. Brain talk is sort of shifting gears to think about the language of regulation. I just want you, we are not in any way, shape, or form walking through all of these units of brain talk, but I want you to know that the story of regulation and integration is a story. It has parts, it has sort of chapters and bits, and different parts of this are going to resonate with a kid in different ways. Carrie and I think it's really important that you don't just pick one chapter of the story and say, okay, we're just going to do this. However, we also both acknowledge that sometimes the buy-in comes from starting at a place where you have real connection for a kid and then using that to be able to back into the rest of the story. But in an ideal world, you are building the story of regulation bit by bit. And while I don't have time, you can find this on the Brain Talk website. If you want to know the scope and sequence, it is right here in the descriptions of the units. So I don't have time to, to really walk through it. I do want to highlight a couple of aspects of brain talk, or sort of use the framework of brain talk to highlight some things that I think are really useful. One is the beauty of externalizing, and in our case, personifying complex neurological concepts to give kids ownership over them. There is a reason that the drawings of brain talk are simplistic, because if a 6-year-old can't draw them, then the 6-year-old doesn't have ownership over the story. It's just another thing that kid is being told. These need to feel really, really approachable to all kids. So I'm gonna play you the video. It's just a couple minutes long. Every unit has a whiteboard animated video. I will be the first to admit that I still, despite having made these with Carrie, I still don't know how to make whiteboard animated videos. So the fact that these exist is a small miracle. This is unit 3. This is Meet Mig. So for those of you saying, I am not a brain expert, I don't know how to talk about this stuff to kids, that's okay. We did it for you. So here's what it would look like. Meet Mig. If I can get there we go.
Remember Mr. Mouse? Remember what he does?
You don't, and that's okay.
He seeks things that are comfy and avoids things that are uncomfy. Avoiding uncomfy things is so
I think the volume went out.
the amygdala.
It's back.
Amygdala means little almond.
Sorry, I'm going to go back just a tiny bit. You're right. It was me. I muted myself. That was very silly of me. Take a drink of water. Sorry, everybody. Here you go.
That he has a part of his brain specifically designed to look for threats. It's called the amygdala. Amygdala means little almond because it actually looks like a little almond in the brain. We'll call it MIG. MIG is like the brain's alarm system. MIG's job is to keep a lookout for things that seem threatening. Just like a smoke detector goes off when it senses the threat of a fire, MIG sounds an emotional alarm in the brain when something feels scary and uncomfy. When MIG gets alarmed, we call it a MIG moment. If a snake came along, Mr. Mouse would have a MIG moment. His pupils would dilate, his heartbeat would quicken, and his brain would look for a way to avoid the danger. Mr. Mouse's MIG moment leads to one or more avoiding reactions: fight, flight, or freeze. The goal is that the scary thing just goes away and leaves him alone. MIG sends the fight, flight, or freeze action message through the rest of Mr. Mouse's nervous system, telling his body to do it.
I'm going to pause there because it goes into just little closing credits. They're simple, they're fast, they pack a punch. And you know what? There's so many places you can go from something like this. Now you may be saying, what's the deal with the mouse? And the deal with the mouse is that we are talking about parts of the brain that exist across all kinds of mammals. We're not just talking about, hey, Jonathan, your brain and your reactivity, we got to fix that. So we better figure out what's broken. We are going to talk about brains. And in fact, we're not even talking about our brains as human brains. We're starting with something that is all about survival and all about comfort, because these are important structures. We're not angry that we have MIG in our brains. We just want to make sure that it's doing its job in a way that is helping us. And so where do you go from here? Well, there's lots of places you can go. Helping a child do something that may seem very simplistic, but to be able to actually identify something that would give you a MIG moment, which is really hard for some kids, really hard. Like, hey, what makes you feel uncomfortable? Nothing. That's impossible because we're here to work on self-regulation or emotional regulation. Like, I know that there are things that make you uncomfortable. That's metacognitive awareness. Maybe you start there. What would your likely MIG moment reaction be? Well, that's tricky to know. That means you actually have to have some self-reflection. And what would the consequences be? Well, geez, that sounds like mental time travel, right? This is how we begin to more concretely do the kind of stuff that we want to see developing in kids' brains. So when we say, well, what could fight, flight, and freeze look like in a person? It can look like a lot of things. And arguably, many of these things can exist in the other columns because something like, something like procrastination could certainly be a flight, sort of a human manifestation of flight, but it also can be a version of freeze, or, you can begin to see where some of these are gray. But all of this is about helping a child become more aware of what is going on for them, to make sense of it. So as a high schooler I was working with years ago once said, he said, I feel like every day I experience emotional terrorism. And that was clearly so because I've held on to it for all this time. But I thought, I don't ever want somebody to feel that way. And sometimes it was the awareness and the ability to have a story so that he didn't feel like such sort of, like, as he would say, he was like, I just become this monster. It's like, you're not a monster. Your brain is trying to do its job. It's just doing it really, really, really well at times that it doesn't really need to be doing that. When fight or flight don't seem like viable options, it makes sense that our brains shunt over to freeze. I can't fight my way through this. I can't get away from this, and I'm just going to shut down and hope that it goes away. And all of this is related to the idea of a MIG moment. Now, at the beginning, I mentioned this distinction between safety and comfort. And this is something that comes up a lot with my students who've experienced trauma. A lot of kids who are coming to the Center for Connection are getting multiple services. And a lot of kids have experienced acute or ongoing trauma of different kinds. And it is very difficult for their brains to separate and make sense of, when do I feel safe and still uncomfortable? Or are there things I do that really are not safe, but they feel good to me? And how do I make sense of all of that? And beginning to brainstorm, well, what exists in some of these different boxes? What is safe and comfortable for you? And this might actually be difficult. Like a kid who's hyper vigilant because they've experienced trauma or, have some significant anxiety in a particular situation. I'm even thinking about a kiddo I work with a diagnosis of selective mutism. When he's in preschool, it's very hard for him to find anything that feels safe and comfortable because his brain is so vigilant in that situation. But to begin to identify things so that we are learning about our own developmental constellations, our own impulse or reactivity and responding constellations. You can, as an adult, think about, well, what would be unsafe but maybe comfortable for someone? Yeah, it feels good to be in contact, feels good to have somebody like ding your phone. It doesn't mean it's safe when you're driving. But I think what's important is that we actually go through some of these exercises for ourselves, so that when we're introducing something like this to a student, as much as you might say, I could fill out that MIG moment paper in an instant. When I do trainings with school teams or districts or therapy teams, we always complete the activities that I'm introducing for ourselves. Because I think it's really disingenuous to expect a child to be able to do something when we ourselves haven't gone through the process of having to reflect on and think about this stuff as well, because often it's more difficult than we think. And separating safety and comfort is a challenge. It's also really important for us to be able to build resilience, because there are times that we need to do things that are uncomfortable and still safe. And that that by doing those things and using proactive regulation strategies before the experience, active strategies during, and retroactive strategies after, we are actually creating the narrative in our brain. Hey, when I experience something like this in the future, I've got a better plan for responding. I'm going to wrap up in these last couple of minutes, and then we're going to shift into Q&A. I want to highlight a couple of more things in your slides before we finish. This actually comes from a later unit of Brain Talk, but I think it's a super excellent, useful framework, which is using our past facts and feelings to build metacognitive or self-awareness and ultimately look for patterns. Now, this is a framework you can apply in so many different ways. That's why I think it is so useful. The way I'm going to apply it right now for our purposes is to beginning to identify situations, or excuse me, to begin to analyze situations that were either triggering or really comfortable. And we can do that by identifying the people, actions, space, and time. Those are the past facts. So people is who was there and what were their roles. So not just it was, Dad and Grandpa Hank and me, but that we also had roles. Grandpa Hank was being the track connector, and Dad was being, the train connector, and I was being the building setter-upper. So using the kind of job talk that some of our, one particular incredible colleague, Sarah Ward, talks about a lot in her work, but helping kids begin to see what was my role in the experience and what were other people's roles in the experience that maybe I went through. And do they have a valid understanding of people's roles, or is there some distortion going on there? What were some of the actions or activities? And where was something happening? You can zoom in, it was at this place, or it was in math class. You can zoom out, something happened at school or at home. And sometimes the zoomed in, more detailed sort of capture of where something happened is super important, because dysregulation is occurring in specific places. Sometimes it's less important because the space or the location of dysregulation or comfort is less of a factor. And then time, again, you can zoom way in. Right before bed could be a time where there's a lot of triggers, or a time that's comfortable, like during movie night on Fridays, something like that. So we talk about the past facts and then also the feelings. Hey, how did you feel when that was going on? And can you rate it on a spectrum from gentle to strong? And maybe there are multiple feelings. All of this reflection, and this is an example of one that I actually did with a student recently. This is a high school student, and you'll see the highlighted parts are some of the more the standout roles that she had assigned to the people who were part of her experience that was highly triggering. And so you can actually see this took a lot of work and a lot of time for us to create, but I want you to be able to see what it can look like to do some really important reflection, and then out of this to be able to identify some patterns. Do you always feel dysregulated when you are presenting in front of a group? Maybe. Or does it have more to do with who the audience is, classmates and teachers? And would it feel different if it was friends? Or does it have more to do with the topic? Like I was in language arts class, and that's a subject that's very difficult for me. Or that it was the last class of the day. And in her case, that actually was a benefit because she knew she could relax after. It was a way that she actually regulated through the experience. But we use this information to create a narrative or a memory. And this is where Miss Hip, the hippocampus, comes into play. And, kids who either are not doing a lot of reflection or are sort of have the anxiety hued glasses that they're looking through when they are reflecting on a narrative, that narrative is not necessarily a helpful narrative to build resilience and regulation in the future. And in many cases, it's a narrative that is teeing that child up to immediately feel an avoid or sort of impulsive seek impulse the next time they encounter something even remotely similar. And so sometimes the work that we're doing is what we call name it to tame it. And that comes from the whole brain child, but it's it is helping to retell these narratives over and over and over again with kids, and sometimes make these subtle incremental adjustments to help them write and then own a narrative that is going to benefit their regulation moving forward. Even if you want to bang your head against a wall, right? That you're like, I cannot believe we're talking about this again. To be able to say, wow, it sounds like you're thinking about blank again. Let's talk about what happened when, that occurred. And making sure that that is a narrative that is sort of helping them process and develop resiliency skills that keep the downstairs brain linked to the upstairs brain. We can use these past facts and feelings to identify patterns of both dysregulation and regulation, which is an excellent thing to do over time, especially if you're in a clinical setting with a child and you get to see them on multiple occasions, or even as a parent. Hey, I've noticed every time you do blank, every time we go here, what do you think about that? And maybe even integrating some of the Ross Green collaborative problem solving language in. All right. That's where we're going to end. I would say pause, but unfortunately we don't get to come back to this this time, but we're going to end here. And what I would love to do is turn some time over to Q&A, even if that is, hey, what would you do if, or even if you just want to reflect with statements and say, here's what this reminds me of, or here's something that I took away from this experience. But the chat box is the best place to do that, so that we're not worried about folks talking over each other. And you have both my brain and Carrie's brain in the metaphorical room, in the Zoom room. So please, any questions you have, now's a great time.
Yeah, questions or comments? You want to read the first?
Yes, the 3 things. You are safe. I am with you while you're feeling blank, and we can solve this together. Some version of the problem solving piece would be at the upstairs part of the brain. I'm going to read through this one from Sarah. I'm just going to read it out loud so that I can process as I go. With anxiety, any advice on how to show an academically strong and accomplished child, to see that from past experiences of successes, how to comfort that same child when they see a school task or project as something impossible, or meltdown over clearly not knowing where to begin, even though they're so capable. Great. So there's a lot packed into that question. I think, the first place to start is that when we have a child who we can look at and say, yeah, but they're no, Sarah, no apologies. I'm just so glad you asked. I mean, it's a meaty question. So I
have a thought too.
Great. Okay. Actually, Carrie, I'm going to turn it over to you because you're here and you're an ed therapist, please.
We have, when we introduce Miss Hip, the hippocampus, we also introduce something called notes to myself. And notes to myself is a really important tool where it's like, wow, I was feeling anxious about this thing, and then I worked on it, and then it was successful. And I'm going to note that to myself. That was I'm always afraid of public speaking, and yet I prepared and I did my public speaking and I got an A. Notes to myself can work the other way too. I decided I only needed to study a couple hours before the test and I didn't get a good grade. Next time I will do it differently. So notes to yourself can be used for a different type of student to help them recognize the bad choices they're making, the outcomes, the bad outcomes from the choices they're making that they don't want to repeat. But for that anxious student, like really just let's write down that we're going to have a success journal. This was successful. Oh, let's add your notes to yourself. This was successful.
Yep. And what all, I mean, yes, that's definitely encapsulates where I was going to go. All I really add is when a child is having a difficult time seeing sort of their own reservoir of successful experiences, which we through Brain Talk, but I think I want to really point it out because this is a very critical aspect of motivation. Is that we have to have positive social experiences in order to develop the motivation to want to tackle new challenges, but also positive social experiences are one of the research-based ways that we actually can sort of tame and calm the downstairs brain, because we have this reservoir, if you will, of success to draw from. And sometimes we might see how full that reservoir is, but the child is not having a felt experience of success. So there may be some work that needs to happen. The notes to self is an excellent way to do it, but to sort of to not just reflect on the times that things didn't work out, which is the way that a lot of folks go, and a lot of executive functioning curricula will suggest, is like, you have to reflect on and analyze what didn't go well to change it for next time. And I don't think that we give enough priority to reflecting on and analyzing what did go well and what was successful, and basking in that feeling like, holy cow, this is done. How does that feel right now? Like really, 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 how does that feel? What does it feel like in your fingers, in your face? I mean, taking a mindfulness route and really reflecting on that feeling, and like, this is what success feels like.
And what led to the success? What would I do again? What would I do again? What can I take away from this? Oh, I now know that the next time I'm feeling anxious and nervous, I can apply this strategy because it was what helped me be successful.
Yeah. Angela, I'm going to jump to your message. You're asking a question about taming the anxieties of a 13-year-old and maybe doing it through this framework, who has recurring fears of parents passing away. I really think this is a place to be able to work on that idea of the name it to tame it, and sort of coming up with a narrative that you may all be evolving and sort of adjusting over time, and sometimes doing together, but sometimes I think doing the work sort of sidelined and then bringing it back into the conversation with your child to say, it sounds like you're thinking about this thing again. Sometimes normalizing a fear does not necessarily honor its validity. So instead of saying things like, I'm going to take a really absurd example just to make sense of what I said. When a kid says, I'm afraid of monsters, with our immediate response is, monsters aren't real. We've minimized a legitimate feeling that they're having. Now, the reason may not be a valid reason that we want to perpetuate, but it is okay to say to a child, gosh, I hear that you're feeling really scared, or to even say to your child, it sounds like you're worrying about what might happen if we weren't alive, or if not, might not be we, but if your parents weren't alive anymore. Let's talk about what we know, or let's talk about the story that we've been creating for our own brains and bodies to make sense of that. And having that narrative or that story that, sometimes you add information into it over time, but usually what you're doing is you're paring down sort of an out of control anxiety spiral that their brain is telling themselves. It would be so horrible, and what would happen, and I would be all alone, and they would be gone. And instead, we go with what makes the most sense, which is, and there's some excellent books and resources that I think can support this, but it's okay to feel worried about people that we love not being with us anymore. And here's what we know. We know that your family is doing all of this wonderful, all these wonderful things to be as healthy as possible. And let's focus on the things that you're doing to keep yourself safe and healthy, without devaluing or sort of devalidating or invalidating, I should say.
Invalidating.
Making up words, the fear that they're actually having. Carrie, anything that you would add to that?
Yeah. So often we have a no response rather than a yes and response. We have a no, but no, you don't need to worry about that because everything's fine. Instead of, yes, that would be really scary. Yes, that's a really scary thing. And if that did happen, there are other people who would take, like the yes, sometimes really validating the worst fear with, yes, that would be scary. And we would still have a plan that would keep you safe if that happened. But then you get to go with the but it's really unlikely to happen because we're doing all these things to keep our family safe. But that validating the worst fear and knowing that even if that happens, you're going to be safe is a way that allows the kids often to then hear that it's not likely to kind of be a scenario.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love what both of you are sharing. And just because, I work in the mental health field, if this really recurs and you feel stumped, I mean, I think everything you said, I agree with. There's always help, and you can ask your 13-year-old, he's old enough, would you like to talk to a specialist? Because counseling might be that neutral third party who could validate what parents or family or friends are saying to help.
And chase, and just what you're saying, Lauren, and chase the why. Like, I wonder why this is recurring for him. Is there something that you can, sort of some threads that you can follow back and begin to understand what maybe where that fear is stemming from? But
making it okay to talk about is also huge, right? Like, not shaming the conversation, but really being curious.
Yep. Debbie, I'm going to bring up your question, and then I think we'll bring it to a close. 11-year-old's been struggling with math. He's in an advanced class. He's been working really hard on his homework. He had a unit test today, and he got a 67, and he's likely going to be upset. Carrie, since you're here, do you have a thought that you want to jump in with? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
I have to think about that one for a bit, because so jump in. You're going to start, and I'll see if I have something to add.
So is this, I'm assuming that this is information he'll get before he comes home. And, just as we've said with everything else, I think it's helpful. It's always helpful to anticipate potential triggers of dysregulation. And it's also helpful to be open to the possibility that it sort of is going to look and feel different than we might anticipate. And so I think keeping our own anxieties and expectations in check is a perfect first place to start. Like, I, as a parent, am really worried that my kid is going to totally flip out about this. And so I might enter into my interaction with my child and bring a bunch of emotional baggage with me. And that already means I'm showing up as sort of not an ideal co-regulator. So I think give yourself some time today to really do what you need to do proactively in order to be as regulated as possible and be available for your son. And chances are he's going to be upset. Like, that's super disappointing. And most people can empathize with the experience of working hard and then having something not work out the way you expected. And while we can't fix that, it's okay to say something along the lines of, I understand, that if he says this is so frustrating or it's not fair, to respond initially and say, I can see how disappointed you are. And I really understand why you'd be feeling so disappointed. You worked really hard to get ready for this test. And maybe just being in the downstairs brain with him for a while, instead of, what do you think didn't go well? Or what could we do next time?
Right. I'm anticipating he's pretty serious and has been nervous about this, and he's going to be in the downstairs brain 100%.
Yeah. So I think, again, knowing that he's going to need some serious co-regulation means that probably the most important thing that you can do as his ideal co-regulator is to be as prepared as possible to not sort of become an emotional tsunami, like your own panic and like feelings of like, I just wanted this for my kid and now it's not there for my kid, and that all stays in check, and that you sort of are this fairly neutral empathizer. And a phrase I really like, Carrie, I might have learned this from you, is sometimes saying to a kid, would you like me to be a listener right now, or a problem solver, or a little of both? And just letting your kid be able to say, or none, right? Or like, and honoring that.
Can you repeat those three things again?
Yeah. Do you want me to be, I usually do it as, what would be helpful right now? Would you like me to be just a listener? Would you like me to be a problem solver with you? Or a little bit, you could either say, or a little bit of both, or because you would be a listener if you were being a problem solver, or neither, or something else. But I think sometimes just letting a kid know, like, I am willing to sit here and just listen to what an unbelievable bummer this is. And I promise that I'm not going to try to fix it. Is
until you're ready. Until you're ready. Yeah.
Exactly what a kid needs.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, Lauren, anything else that you want to say or do before we wrap up?
I just want to, thank everybody for being here, for taking the time. The more we as adults, as parents, teachers, therapists, educators, take the time to understand our own downstairs brain and upstairs brain and really self-reflect, that's the first step. And we find that when we really learn more about ourselves and our thinking and our regulation, we are then in such an empowered place to help our kiddos. So I thank you, Hanna and Carrie, for the work that you've done with Brain Talk. The curriculum is one of my favorites. And if anybody has questions, please reach out. You'll get an email after. If you did not get the handout, anybody who registered got the handout. So thank you again for that. And if you didn't and you would like it, you can email. And we're happy to, continue this conversation because this was really just like an awesome intro.
Yes, very much an intro. We'll do that. We'll save the 2-day, 8-hour a day remainder for.
We might have to reinvent something that we could do virtually because we could do this virtually. So yeah, you're getting lots of thank yous for this helpful presentation. So yeah, we're so
Lauren,
appreciative.
Question about the recorded access. Do you just want to speak to what people should do if they are trying to access the recording?
Yes. Let me stop the recording now. I'll say thank you.